British interests, and the rise of Egyptian nationalism. The year 1869 marked a turning point in global trade and imperial geopolitics with the inauguration of the Suez Canal. This monumental engineering feat, hewn through the Egyptian desert, linked the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea and drastically reduced the maritime journey between Europe and Asia. For the British Empire, whose strategic and economic lifelines extended to India, the canal quickly assumed paramount importance. In 1875, seizing an opportunity to solidify British influence, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli orchestrated the purchase of a 44% stake in the Suez Canal Company from the financially overextended Khedive Ismail. This acquisition, facilitated through a loan from the Rothschild banking house, enabled Britain to assert de facto control over the canal, diminishing French dominance and laying the groundwork for direct imperial intervention in Egypt. Although the canal was celebrated as a marvel of modern engineering, largely due to the efforts of French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, it came at an extraordinary human cost. Tens of thousands of Egyptian peasants, coerced under the corvée labor system, toiled in brutal conditions. Thousands perished from disease, heat exhaustion, and maltreatment. Despite bearing this burden, the Egyptian population received no material benefit from the canal's profits or prestige. Egypt, though nominally under the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire, was effectively governed by the Khedive, who wielded extensive autonomy. Ismail Pasha, the reigning Khedive, embarked on an ambitious campaign of modernization. Inspired by European capitals, he sought to remake Cairo in the image of Paris, investing in railways, telegraph lines, grand boulevards, and lavish celebrations such as the canal's inauguration. However, these efforts plunged Egypt into unsustainable debt, which by 1878 had reached over £90 million. This financial crisis was not merely the result of development spending. It was exacerbated by a series of irresponsible fiscal decisions and structural weaknesses. Ismail's administration borrowed heavily from European banks, often under unfavorable terms with exorbitant interest rates. Many of these loans were negotiated hastily and without parliamentary oversight, sometimes at interest rates exceeding 12%. Corruption further drained state coffers. Government contracts were awarded without bidding, and public officials often took hefty commissions. Additionally, Ismail's desire to assert Egypt's independence from the Ottoman Empire led him to finance a series of military ventures and diplomatic initiatives aimed at elevating Egypt's regional standing. The ill-fated military campaigns in Sudan and Ethiopia, such as the defeats at Gundet and Gura, not only ended in embarrassment but also consumed vast financial and human resources. Extravagant court spending and construction of dozens of ornate palaces for the royal family further compounded the crisis. By the late 1870s, Egypt was unable to meet its debt obligations. Annual interest payments alone consumed over half of state revenue. Foreign creditors, primarily British and French, used this financial leverage to push for direct control over Egypt's economy, leading to the imposition of the dual control system in 1879. To protect their financial interests, Britain and France imposed a system of dual control, which placed Egypt's finances under the direct supervision of European officials. The result was a loss of Egyptian sovereignty. European advisors dictated tax policies and state spending. Foreign nationals were insulated from local jurisdiction through the capitulations, exacerbating the exclusion of Egyptians from their own institutions. This deepened economic and political inequality within the country. Among the most visibly disenfranchised were the Egyptian military officers. The size of the army was drastically reduced, from 94,000 men in 1874 to 36,000 by 1879, and high-ranking positions were increasingly reserved for Ottoman Turks, Circassians, and Europeans. Native Egyptian officers were denied promotions and subjected to ethnic discrimination. National humiliation was compounded by military defeats, such as the catastrophic battles of Gundet, 1875, and Gura, 1876, against Ethiopia, which exposed the weakness of the restructured Egyptian army and underscored the failure of foreign-led reforms. This atmosphere of humiliation, exclusion, and economic hardship fostered deep resentment among Egyptians across social strata. In the military, among civil servants, and within the educated middle classes, nationalist sentiments began to coalesce. At the center of this rising tide stood Colonel Ahmed Arabi, a native Egyptian of peasant origin, who would soon become the face of resistance against foreign domination and the spearhead of what would become known as the Arabi revolt. Ahmed Arabi and the struggle for Egyptian sovereignty. By the summer of 1882, Egypt stood on the threshold of profound political transformation. The Arabi revolt, initially a protest within the military against ethnic and professional discrimination, had evolved into a nationwide movement. It challenged both the entrenched autocracy of the Khedive regime and the growing hegemony of European powers, particularly Britain and France. At the forefront of this uprising was Colonel Ahmed Arabi, whose ascent from peasant origins to national leadership symbolized a broader Egyptian aspiration for independence, dignity, and reform. By mid-1882, Arabi had been appointed Minister of War and had become the de facto leader of a populist coalition seeking comprehensive political and social change. The movement's objectives were clear: the establishment of a constitutional government, the expulsion of foreign influence from military and administration, and the integration of native Egyptians into the highest ranks of governance. To European powers, however, the surge of Egyptian nationalism represented an existential threat to their strategic and financial interests, most notably the Suez Canal and the repayment of Egypt's considerable foreign debt. While France opted for restraint, Britain acted decisively. In July 1882, under the pretext of protecting the canal and restoring order, British naval forces bombarded the port city of Alexandria. Shortly thereafter, a full-scale land invasion commenced. Ahmed Arabi's background offered a stark contrast to the traditional ruling elite. Born in 1841 in the village of Hiryat Razna near Zagazig in the Nile Delta, he hailed from a modest peasant family. Benefiting from mid-century reforms under Khedive Said Pasha, which opened military schools to Egyptians of non-elite origin. Arabi enrolled in the military academy and steadily rose through the officer ranks. He also pursued studies at Al-Azhar University, acquiring a reputation for both discipline and intellect. However, by the 1870s, this pathway to advancement for native Egyptians was increasingly obstructed. High-ranking positions in the army and civil service were overwhelmingly awarded to Turks, Circassians, and Europeans, many of whom received disproportionately high salaries and privileges. Native officers faced systematic exclusion and stagnation, contributing to growing discontent within the ranks. Arabi first entered the national spotlight in 1881, when he publicly opposed discriminatory policies within the army. His protests gained rapid support among fellow officers and resonated with a broader public frustrated by foreign domination, economic hardship, and political marginalization. Arabi's humble origins and principled defiance elevated him as a symbol of popular resistance, particularly among the rural peasantry. The movement that coalesced around Arabi was rooted in three fundamental demands: the removal of foreign control from Egypt's military and governmental institutions, the implementation of constitutional limitations on the autocratic powers of the Khedive, the expansion of opportunity for native Egyptians to serve in leadership positions within both the civil and military spheres. A turning point came in September 1881, when Arabi and his supporters mobilized military forces and surrounded the Abdin Palace in Cairo. Under pressure, Khedive Tofek conceded to several demands, including the dismissal of the unpopular war minister and the initiation of political reforms. For the first time in modern Egyptian history, The authority of the ruler had been publicly challenged and partially constrained by popular and military pressure. By early 1882, Arabi had attained the position of Minister of War. However, his authority extended far beyond the official title. He had become, in the eyes of many Egyptians, the embodiment of national resistance. His public addresses, widely disseminated and passionately delivered, called for patriotism, social justice, and the right of Egyptians to determine their own destiny. To many, he represented a new political ideal, an Egyptian leader rooted in the people, uncorrupted by foreign influence or aristocratic detachment. Nevertheless, the movement was ultimately overwhelmed by British military intervention. On September 13, 1882, British forces under General Sir Garnet Wolseley decisively defeated Arabi's army at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. Despite Arabi's efforts to fortify his position, the Egyptian troops, lacking cohesion, modern armaments, and adequate training, were overrun in a surprise night attack. The fall of Tel el-Kebir cleared the path for British occupation of Cairo and marked the collapse of organized resistance. Arabi was arrested, tried by a special tribunal, and initially sentenced to death. However, under international and domestic pressure, his sentence was commuted to exile in Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka. Though the revolt was suppressed, its legacy endured. British occupation of Egypt would continue until the mid-20th century, but the ideals championed by Arabi, national sovereignty, constitutional governance, and resistance to imperial domination, would influence successive generations of Egyptian nationalists. Defeat and British occupation. The British came to Egypt to exploit, not to help. As Ahmed Arabi's influence expanded, it provoked increasing alarm among both the ruling Khedive and the European powers that had long regarded Egypt as a strategic and economic dependency. For Britain and France, the rise of Egyptian nationalism under Arabi posed a direct challenge. European leaders feared that Arabi's movement would destabilize Egypt, jeopardize the repayment of the country's vast foreign debt, and most importantly, threaten control over the Suez Canal, the vital maritime corridor that served as Britain's gateway to India and its broader imperial interests in Asia. In June 1882, mounting tensions erupted in Alexandria. Anti-European riots broke out in the city, fueled by years of economic injustice, colonial arrogance, and political resentment. European property was looted and lives were lost. Britain seized upon this unrest as justification for military intervention. In early July, without formal declaration of war, British warships under Admiral Sir Beecham Seymour commenced a relentless bombardment of Alexandria's coastal defenses. The shelling was devastating. For hours, British naval guns rained heavy fire on the city's forts, harbor installations, and residential districts. Although Egyptian gunners returned fire from their batteries, they were hopelessly outmatched. Much of Alexandria's historic core was leveled. Fires raged through entire quarters of the city. Thousands of civilians fled in panic. Others perished amid the wreckage. Once celebrated as a cosmopolitan jewel of the Mediterranean, Alexandria was left in ruins. Though the city had fallen, Arabi refused to concede defeat. In the weeks that followed, he mobilized Egypt's defenses, fortifying strategic positions throughout the Nile Delta and along key routes to Cairo. His objective was clear: to prevent a full-scale British conquest of the country. The decisive confrontation came at Tel el-Kebir. British forces under General Sir Garnet Wolseley landed at the Suez Canal and advanced inland with precision and speed. Wolseley recognized the need to strike swiftly before Arabi could consolidate his defensive positions. At Tel el-Kebir, approximately 110 kilometers northeast of Cairo, Arabi established his final line of defense. His army, numbering around 30,000 men, constructed trenches, earthworks, and artillery emplacements. The position was strong on paper, but his troops, many of them conscripts, were weary from rapid mobilization, undersupplied, and demoralized following the fall of Alexandria. Wolseley devised a bold and risky strategy: a night march across the desert. On the night of September 12, 1882, 13,000 British troops began a silent advance under the cover of darkness. Guided by the moon and strict discipline, they crossed miles of barren terrain, arriving at the Egyptian lines just before dawn. At daybreak on September 13th, the British launched a sudden and ferocious assault. The Egyptian soldiers, many still unprepared or asleep in their positions, responded with confusion and uneven resistance. Although some artillery units managed to fire upon the advancing enemy, coordination between Egyptian units collapsed. The British infantry, advancing in disciplined formations, quickly exploited weaknesses in the defensive line. Bayonet charges and close-quarters combat followed. Within a single hour, Arabi's forces were routed. Thousands fled in disarray. Others surrendered. The road to Cairo lay unguarded. Recognizing the futility of further resistance, Ahmed Arabi surrendered within days. Cairo capitulated without a fight. The nationalist hopes of Egyptian sovereignty were crushed. Arabi was arrested and charged with rebellion. Though some within the British establishment called for his execution, political pressure, especially from British liberals sympathetic to his cause, led to a more lenient outcome. He was sentenced to exile in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, where he would remain for nearly 2 decades. In 1901, Arabi was permitted to return to Egypt, where he died the following year. His defeat did not merely mark the end of an uprising. It signaled the beginning of a new era of foreign domination. Egypt would remain under British occupation for nearly 70 years, its autonomy effectively dismantled, its fate controlled from London rather than Cairo. Aftermath and the loss of Egyptian sovereignty. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir was not merely a military defeat. It was a turning point in Egyptian history. With the collapse of Ahmed Arabi's forces, the Arabi revolt came to an end, and a new era of foreign domination began. Although the British restored Khedive Tofek to the throne, he now ruled in name only. Real power passed into the hands of British officials, who assumed control over Egypt's finances, military, and administration. While British leaders maintained that their occupation was temporary, it would last for more than 70 years. In effect, Egypt's sovereignty was extinguished. The nationalist aspirations that had animated Arabi and his supporters, the dream of constitutional government, national dignity, and self-determination, were buried under the weight of imperial ambition. Yet Ahmed Arabi's legacy would not be so easily silenced. For the first time in modern Egyptian history, a leader of peasant origin had risen to articulate a broad national vision. Arabi had defied both foreign control and domestic despotism. He had demanded a constitution, equality before the law, and the right of native Egyptians to shape their own future. Although his movement ended in defeat, the principles he championed endured. The Arabi revolt became a foundational memory in Egypt's nationalist imagination. Its ideals inspired the mass uprising of 1919 and later echoed to the revolution of 1952, when Egypt would finally cast off both monarchy and foreign domination. To generations of Egyptians, Arabi was not merely a failed rebel. He was a symbol of resistance, dignity, and the possibility of national renewal. From a military standpoint, The British victory at Tel El Kebir demonstrated the tactical advantage of discipline, mobility, and surprise, particularly in desert warfare. But politically, it marked a profound loss, the suppression of Egypt's first modern attempt at self-rule. And yet, despite his defeat and exile, Ahmed Arabi accomplished something no foreign occupation could erase. He awakened a nation,